"You'll get nothing from your father, my stepmother," said her voice calm, measured final, like she was reading from a script that had already been signed and sealed. And for a long time, I believed her. But at exactly 10:17 a.m., in a quiet law office on the 32nd floor, overlooking downtown Chicago, when the attorney reached Clause 7, Diane Carter didn't just lose her composure, she collapsed. Not because of grief, not because of shock, but because for the first time, she realized she had misunderstood everything. If you've ever been told you didn't matter in your own family, I want to know where you're watching from right now and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments, and if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing, because what happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was precise, and it changed everything. The room that morning was exactly what you would expect, from a high-profile estate-reading polished wood table, floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a tray of untouched bottled water set neatly in the corner. Diane sat at the head of the table in a tailored black suit posture, straight hands folded like she already owned the outcome. Across from her, two of her attorneys flipped through a thick binder, their movements quiet, efficient. I took the seat at the far end, not because anyone told me to, but because that's where I had learned to sit. Out of the way, unimportant, invisible. I placed my hands in my lap and said nothing. I had worn a simple navy dress, nothing expensive, nothing that would invite attention. Diane glanced at me once briefly, the kind of look you give someone you don't expect to matter, then turned back to the attorney, as if the room had already settled into its final shape. "Let's begin," she said. Her tone carried the same certainty I had heard at the dinner table 3 months earlier, the night everything shifted. The night she poured herself a glass of red wine, set it carefully on a white marble coaster, and told me, without raising her voice, "Your father made his intentions very clear. You won't be receiving anything." I remember the reflection of the overhead light in that glass, the way the liquid barely moved when she set it down. I remember my father sitting beside her, silent, his hand resting flat against the table, as if he had nothing to add. I had looked at him then, waiting, just for a second, for something, a correction, a hesitation, anything, but there was nothing. I understood. I said nothing. And now, sitting in that office, I watched as the attorney opened the folder, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. The words were formal, structured, expected, names, dates, allocations. Diane remained still, occasionally nodding, as if everything was unfolding exactly the way she had planned. I didn't move. I didn't react. Because the truth was, there was a second document, a second structure, something my father had never discussed at that table, something Diane had never mentioned, something that had been waiting quietly behind everything she thought she controlled. And when the attorney turned the page and paused just for a fraction of a second, I knew we were there. Clause 7. The room didn't change. The view outside the window didn't shift. The city kept moving exactly the same way it had a moment before. But inside that room, something invisible cracked. The attorney cleared his throat. Diane leaned forward slightly, just enough to show interest. And then he began to read. "Clause 7, the attorney said, his voice even almost careful, like he understood the weight of what he was about to read before anyone else in the room did. Diane shifted in her chair just slightly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I did. I always noticed the small things. In accordance with the secondary estate structure, established on May 14th, he continued all controlling interests, liquid assets, and associated holdings previously assigned under the primary will are subject to immediate transfer into an irrevocable trust." He paused, letting the words settle. Diane blinked once, slow, measured. "The sole beneficiary of said trust is Emily Carter." For a moment, nothing moved. Not the attorneys, not the heir, not even Diane. It was as if the room had been placed on hold, suspended between two versions of reality. The one she believed in, and the one that had just been read aloud. "That is not correct," Diane said finally, her voice controlled but thinner, now less certain. "Continue," the attorney replied, not looking up, simply turning the page with the same steady motion he had used before. The trust was structured to activate upon the formal reading of the will, superseding any prior allocations outlined in the primary document. Paper shifted. A pen rolled slightly across the table and stopped. Furthermore, the designated executor of this trust holds full authority over all financial decisions effective immediately. Another pause. Shorter this time, that executor is Emily Carter. I did not move, I did not speak. I kept my hands exactly where they had been since I sat down, in my lap. Still, Diane's chair scraped softly against the floor as she leaned forward, her composure beginning to fracture in small, precise ways. There must be a mistake, she said, looking between the attorneys, searching for someone to correct the narrative, to restore the version of events she had been living in. No one answered. No one rushed to clarify, because there was nothing to clarify. It was all there. Documented, signed, filed. This secondary structure, one of her attorneys said, carefully flipping through the binder again faster. Now, we were not made aware of this. I watched as Diane's expression changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in layers. Confidence giving way to confusion, confusion tightening into something sharper, fear maybe, or realization. He would not have done this without telling me, she said, but the statement lacked conviction. It sounded less like truth and more like hope. The attorney adjusted his glasses again. The documentation appears to have been executed independently, he said. Privately. Privately. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. I felt it settle quiet and exact. Because I remembered the envelope, the one with my name on it, the one Diane never saw. I remembered the date, the signature. The second set of instructions that never touched the dinner table, never entered her version of the story. I had not needed to fight. I had not needed to argue. I had only needed to wait. Diane's hand moved to the table, steadying herself as if the ground beneath her had shifted just enough to throw off her balance. Her eyes found mine then. For the first time that morning, not dismissive, not indifferent, but searching. I held her gaze, calm, unmoved. She opened her mouth to speak again, but nothing came out. And in that silence, everything she thought she controlled slipped out of her hands without a single raised voice. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched thin and fragile, like something that could tear if anyone moved too quickly. And for the first time since I had walked into that room, Diane looked smaller, not physically, not in a way anyone could measure, but in the way her certainty no longer filled the space around her. That is not possible, she said again, softer now, as if repeating. It might reshape what had already been read into something she could still control. One of her attorneys leaned closer, flipping pages faster, the crisp sound of paper echoing slightly in the otherwise quiet room. We need to review the full documentation, he said, under his breath, but it was loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough to confirm what had already become obvious. They had not known. Not about the trust, not about the structure, not about any of it. I watched Diane's hand move toward the binder, her fingers hovering for a second before pressing down on the page as if she could physically stop the words from existing. Richard would have discussed this, she said, her voice tightening around his name. He would not make a decision like this. Without telling me, I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar, the assumption that everything important had passed through her, that nothing could exist outside her reach. I remembered the study, the one at the end of the hallway, the door that was always closed after 10 o'clock, the faint glow of a desk lamp under the frame. I remembered the night I knocked, and my father opened it just enough to speak, not wide, not inviting, just enough. You should get some rest, he had said, but there was something different in his tone, something deliberate, something final, and when I turned to leave, I saw it on the desk behind him, a second folder, not the one Diane kept in the main office. Not the one she reviewed with her attorneys. This one was thinner, darker, and it was placed slightly apart from everything else, like it did not belong to the same set. I had not asked about it. I did not need to. I understood then the same way. I understood now. Some decisions are not announced. They are prepared, quietly, precisely without discussion. Back in the room, Diane's breathing had changed, subtle but uneven, her shoulders rising just a little higher with each breath, as if she was trying to keep control of something that was already slipping. "There has to be a condition," she said, looking directly at the attorney, now searching for a loophole, a limitation, anything that would reduce what had just been given. "A way there is," he replied. Calm, professional, unshaken, the condition is activation upon this reading, which has now occurred. The words landed clean, without emphasis, without emotion, but they carried more weight than anything she had said that morning. Activation, not pending, not negotiable, not reversible, final. I felt it settle in the room, the shift from expectation to reality, from assumption to fact. Diane's gaze moved back to me again, slower this time, more deliberate, like she was trying to reconcile the version of me she had dismissed with the position I now held. I met her eyes without hesitation, without expression, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to argue. Everything that needed to be said had already been written, signed, and placed exactly where it needed to be. And in that moment, the balance of the room changed completely. Not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something quieter, something colder ownership. Diane did not sit back down right away. She remained half standing, one hand still pressed against the table, as if the surface beneath her was the only stable thing left in the room. Her attorney leaned closer again, this time not flipping pages, but scanning eyes moving faster, sharper, searching for something that was not there. "We need to verify the execution details," he said, but the confidence in his voice had already shifted. It was no longer leading, it was following, catching up to something that had already been decided long before. This morning, the primary attorney closed, the folder slowly, deliberately aligning the edges with a quiet precision that made the moment feel even more final. "Documentation has been verified prior to this reading," he said, looking directly at Diane. Now not unkind, but firm. "All signatures are valid, all filings are complete, and the trust has been active in structure since the date listed." Diane's lips parted slightly as if she was about to argue, but no words came out, not immediately. And in that pause, I saw it not confusion anymore, not even denial, but the beginning of understanding, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but builds in layers, connecting details that had once seemed separate into something whole, something undeniable. "Since the date listed," she repeated quietly, her voice almost to herself now, and I knew exactly which date she had just realized. May 14th. The same week she had hosted that dinner, the same week she had poured wine into crystal glasses and told me with complete certainty that I would receive nothing. I remembered the table, the polished surface, the way she had smiled, just slightly, when she said it, like it was already settled. Already done. I had nodded, then not because I agreed, but because I understood something she did not. That certainty does not come from saying something out loud. It comes from what is written when no one is watching. Diane's fingers curled slightly against the table, her nails tapping once a small, involuntary sound that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. He would not have hidden. "This," she said again, but this time the words sounded different. Not like a statement, but like a question. She was asking herself. One of her attorneys shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing between her and the folder. "There are provisions here indicating independent counsel," he said, carefully choosing each word with more caution now, "which suggests the arrangement was made without external disclosure." Without external disclosure, the phrase settled heavily, because it meant exactly what it sounded like. There had been a boundary, a line drawn that she was never meant to cross. I felt a strange calm settle over me, not satisfaction, not relief, just clarity. The kind that comes when something you have suspected for a long time finally reveals itself completely. Diane straightened slightly, but the movement lacked its earlier confidence. It was slower, more deliberate, like she was recalibrating in real time, trying to find footing in a reality that no longer matched the one she had built. Her eyes moved across the table, again, not scanning now, but searching. And when they landed on me, they stayed there longer than before. Longer than any look she had given me in years. I did not look away. I did not shift. I simply met her gaze the same way I had met everything else that morning, quietly, steadily, without interruption, because there was nothing left to interrupt. The structure had already done that for me. The documents had already spoken, and for the first time, she was the one who had to listen. Diane finally lowered herself back into the chair, but the movement was not controlled, not deliberate. It was slow, almost uncertain, like she was no longer fully aware of where the edges of the room were. Her attorney reached for a glass of water and slid it toward her without a word. The bottle made a soft sound against the polished table, small but sharp enough to cut through the silence that had settled over everything. She did not pick it up right away. Her eyes were still fixed on the folder, on the exact place where the attorney had stopped reading, as if the words might rearrange themselves if she stared long enough. "This changes nothing about the primary, Will," she said. Suddenly, her voice, returning in fragments, trying to rebuild structure where it had already been removed. "The house, the accounts, those were assigned to me." She looked up quickly, searching for confirmation for alignment. For someone to restore the version of control she had been holding onto. The attorney nodded once, but it was not agreement, it was clarification. "Those assets were listed under the primary document," he said carefully. "However, the secondary structure supersedes ownership upon activation, which has now occurred." The distinction was subtle, but it was absolute. Diane's hand moved again this time, reaching for the glass, her fingers wrapping around it just a little too tightly. The water inside shifted, catching the light from the window. I watched the movement, the small tremor that ran through her hand, and I understood something. Then this was not about losing everything at once. It was about losing it in pieces. Precise, documented layers, each one removing a part of what she believed she held. "There has to be a limitation," she said more urgently, now turning to her attorney again. "A trust cannot just transfer everything without restriction." Her voice carried a sharp edge again, but it no longer filled the room the same way. It no longer directed the outcome, it followed it. "There are restrictions," the primary attorney replied, turning one more page, his finger tracing a line of text. Before he continued, "The trustee, Emily Carter, has full discretion over asset management, distribution, and liquidation." He paused briefly, just enough for the words to settle. Effective immediately. I felt the weight of that sentence land. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just exact, like a key turning in a lock that had already been built. Diane's eyes moved to me again, faster this time, sharper, as if she was looking for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that would suggest this could still be negotiated. I did not give her that I kept. My posture the same, my hands still, my expression unchanged, because there was nothing to negotiate, nothing to defend. Everything had already been decided in a room she was never part of. She leaned back slightly, but the movement did not carry confidence. It carried distance, like she was trying to step away from something she could no longer reach. "You knew," she said quietly, not accusing, not loud, just a statement placed carefully between us. I met her eyes without hesitation, without reaction, and after a moment I answered. I understood the words were simple, but they did not need to be anything else, because understanding had never required noise. It had required patience, and now sitting in that room, watching everything she had built shift away from her, one clause at a time, I realized that silence had not been weakness. It had been preparation. The room did not return to normal. After that, it did not settle back into polite conversation or quiet professionalism. It stayed exactly where it was suspended, in that thin space where control had already shifted, but no one had fully adjusted to it. Yet one of Diane's attorneys cleared his throat. Again, this time more deliberately, as if trying to reestablish structure. "We should proceed with the remaining items," he said, but even that sounded secondary now. Like everything else on the agenda had lost its weight. The primary attorney nodded once and turned another page, continuing with the formal reading. Smaller allocations, personal effects, minor accounts, details that would have mattered an hour ago, but now felt distant, reduced. Diane did not interrupt. Again she sat, still, her hands now resting flat against the table, no longer gripping, no longer reaching. just placed there as if she was trying to steady herself in a space that no longer responded to her. I watched her carefully, not out of curiosity, but because I had learned to read the small shifts, the ones that reveal more than words, ever. Could her shoulders have lowered, her posture no longer carried that sharp forward angle? It had softened, not relaxed, but recalibrated, like she was slowly understanding that this was not a moment. She could redirect this, was a result she had to face. The attorney finished the last page and closed the folder with a quiet final motion. "This concludes the formal reading," he said, his voice returning to its original tone, steady, professional, complete. No one spoke immediately after that. Silence returned, but it was different now. Heavier, settled, no longer waiting for something to happen, because everything already had. Diane's attorney leaned in toward her, speaking quietly, too low for the others to hear clearly. But I saw the movement, the slight shake of his head, the small pause before he spoke. The kind that comes when there are no easy solutions left to offer. Diane listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed somewhere just beyond the table, on the documents anymore. Not on me, but on something internal. Something she was trying to reconstruct piece by piece. After a moment, she nodded, once, slow, controlled, then reached for the glass of water again. This time, lifting it, taking a small sip, setting it back down with care. The movement was deliberate, almost practiced, as if she was trying to regain precision in a situation that had taken it from her. I shifted slightly in my seat, just enough to reach for my bag, the leather strap, cool against my fingers, grounding familiar. I did not rush. I did not stand immediately. I allowed the moment to complete itself fully before moving, because that was the difference. Now I did not need to react quickly. I did not need to anticipate what came next. Everything had already been placed exactly where it needed to be. Diane finally looked at me again, but this time the expression was different. Not searching, not challenging, but assessing, as if she was seeing me for the first time without the assumptions she had carried for years. "This is not over," she said quietly. The words measured, controlled, but lacking the certainty they once had. I held her gaze for a brief moment before answering. My voice calm, even without emphasis. "It already is." And in that moment I realized something with complete clarity. Closure does not come from raising your voice. It comes from knowing there is nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove, nothing left to take from you. I stood up slowly, not abruptly, not in a way that drew attention, just enough to signal that my part in the room was complete. The chair moved back with a soft sound against the floor. Controlled, measured, I adjusted the strap of my bag over my shoulder and glanced once at the folder still resting in front of the attorney, closed, now quiet, but heavier than anything that had been said out loud. Diane did not move as I stepped away from the table, but I could feel her attention. "Follow me." Not the dismissive glance from earlier, not the quick evaluation she used to give me at dinner. This was different, sustained, deliberate. I reached the door and paused for just a second, not to hesitate, but to acknowledge the shift that had already happened. The room behind me was no longer a place where I had to prove anything. It was a place where everything had already been proven. Without me saying a word, I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The air outside felt cooler, quieter. The low hum of the building, replacing the tension I had just left behind. I walked toward the elevators at a steady pace. Each step even unhurried, the polished floor reflecting faint outlines of movement. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. Just a transition from one space to another. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. The numbers lit up one by one as the doors closed, and for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to exhale. Not deeply, not emotionally, just enough to release what was no longer necessary to hold. I looked at my reflection in the mirrored panel. The same navy dress, the same composed posture. Nothing about me had changed on the outside, but everything about my position had shifted. I thought briefly about the envelope again, the one my father had left, the one that had never been discussed at the table, the one that had carried more weight than any conversation we ever had. I remembered the way his handwriting looked on the front. Precise, intentional, not rushed, not careless. I had opened it alone, standing in the hallway outside his study, reading every line twice before folding it back the same way it had been. Not because I did not understand it, but because I did. Completely, the elevator slowed. As it approached the lobby, the soft chimes signaling arrival, the doors opened, and I stepped out into the wide open space. Sunlight filtering through the glass entrance, people moving in and out without noticing anything unusual, without knowing what had just shifted 32 floors above them. I walked toward the exit, the weight of the bag against my shoulder. Steady, familiar. I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The city moved exactly the same as it had before. Cars passing, people crossing the street. Nothing paused, nothing reacted. And that was the point. Not every change needs to be seen to be real. Some of them happened quietly, precisely in rooms where only a few people are present. And when I reached the curb, I did not look back, not because I was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind that belonged to me anymore. Everything that did was already moving forward with me. The air outside felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just clearer. Like something that had been quietly pressing against everything for years had finally been removed. I stepped away from the building and onto the sidewalk, the sound of traffic blending into a steady rhythm, predictable, controlled, nothing like the room I had just left. My phone remained silent in my hand, no messages, no missed calls, no sudden urgency, and that in itself said everything for years. Every shift in that house had come with noise, with instructions, with expectations that were never written down, but always enforced. And now there was nothing, just space. I walked a few blocks without a destination, letting the movement settle into something steady, familiar, my heels clicking softly against the pavement, each step measured, consistent. I passed a glass storefront and caught my reflection again, the same navy dress, the same composed expression. But there was something else. Now, something subtle, not visible but present ownership, not loud, not displayed, just understood. I reached into my bag and felt the edge of the envelope still tucked inside the paper, slightly worn from being opened and closed more than once. I had not brought it into the room. I did not need to. Everything inside it had already been placed exactly where it needed to be. I paused at a crosswalk, the red hand signaling me to wait. Cars moving steadily in front of me. I remembered the first time I read the letter inside that envelope, standing alone in the hallway, the house quiet in a way. It had not been in years. My father's handwriting precise, each word deliberate, not emotional, not explanatory, just clear instruction structure. Intent. He had not apologized. He had not justified. He had simply ensured, and that was the difference. Not what he said, but what he set in place. The light changed, and I stepped forward, crossing with the rest of the crowd, no one noticing, no one reacting, and that felt right because nothing about what had happened required an audience. It had already been witnessed by the only people who needed to see it. I reached the opposite side and stopped, briefly adjusting the strap of my bag. Again, grounding myself in the present moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was aware fully of where I stood now. Not in that house, not at that table, not under someone else's version of control, but here, moving forward on my own terms. My phone buzzed once in my hand, a single notification. I glanced down at the screen, an unknown number. I let it ring once more before answering my voice. Calm, steady. This is Emily. A brief pause on the other end. Then voice professional, measured Miss Carter. This is Daniel Harris from Carter & Wells. We will need to schedule a follow-up regarding the trust management and asset transition. I listened, not interrupting, letting the words settle. Of course, I replied. Simple, direct, no hesitation, because there was nothing left to question. Everything had already been decided, and now it was simply a matter of moving through it. One step at a time, with the same quiet precision that had brought me here in the first place. The call ended as simply as it had begun. No long conversation, no unnecessary words, just confirmation, a time, a location, and a clear next step. I slipped my phone back into my bag and stood there for a moment, longer, watching the city move around me, steady, indifferent, unchanged. And that was the final realization. Nothing outside had shifted. No one stopped walking. No one turned to look. No one reacted, because the only place anything had ever been unbalanced was inside that house. Inside that structure, inside the version of the story Diane had controlled for years. Now that structure no longer existed, I walked toward the corner and turned right. The sunlight reflecting off the glass buildings in sharp lines, clean, defined. Everything felt precise, intentional. The same way the documents had been written, the same way my father had chosen to act without speaking. I thought about him again, not the version Diane described, not the one who stayed silent at the table, but the one who had stayed up late behind a closed door, building something she could not see, something she could not interrupt, something that did not need to be explained because it was designed to work without permission. I understood that now more clearly than ever. He had not argued, he had not corrected her. He had not tried to win the moment he had built the outcome instead, and that outcome had unfolded exactly when it was meant to, not earlier, not later. But at the precise second, it could no longer be undone. I stopped at another crosswalk, the light still red, the sound of traffic steady in front of me, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to feel it, not anger, not relief, but something quieter, something complete closure, not given, not offered, but created. I did not need an apology, I did not need recognition, I did not need anyone to admit what had happened, because the truth had already been documented, enforced, and finalized. The light changed, and I stepped forward, blending into the movement of people crossing beside me, just another figure in the city. Nothing remarkable, nothing noticeable, and that felt right because everything that mattered had already happened. Where it needed to, not in public, not for attention, but in a room with a table, a folder, and a set of words that could not be rewritten. As I reached the other side, I adjusted my pace, slightly steady, consistent forward, and before I moved on, I want to ask you something. If you have ever been in a situation where your own family made you feel like you had nothing, like your place could be erased, without question, comment number 1. If you have ever heard a story like this happen to someone else, comment number 2. And if you never want to find yourself in a position like this, comment number 3, or share your own perspective, because stories like this are not just about what was taken. They are about what was built quietly in response, and sometimes that quiet preparation changes everything. I kept walking, not looking back, not because I needed to forget, but because I finally understood there was nothing behind me that I needed to carry forward anymore. Everything that mattered was already mine.